Good morning to all. I would like to welcome you to the Failure-Free Reading Plight of the Non-Responder Overview with Dr. Joe Lockavitch. We are getting ready to begin. Please keep your lines muted, and we're going to have a great presentation. We thank Dr. Lockavitch for sharing this information with us and introducing us to some theories and information pertaining to non-responders and how we can help those students to become more effective in the classroom. Dr. Lockavitch, thank you for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you, Jamal. It's very, very exciting to be here. And as we said, for those of you who are joining us, we said that we would start promptly on the hour, and we will finish exactly 30 minutes from now. I will leave time after that 30 minutes if anyone would like to hang around and ask any questions. So that said, let us begin. And I look forward to this session, and I look forward to having the opportunity to share this important research and information concerning this particular population. All right. As you all know, state waivers are now replacing NCLB. With the exception of less than a half a dozen states now, most of them are now moving into the waivers. And one of the key components is that accountability in the waivers is going to center on two key factors. The first will clearly be meeting the Common Core standards. And one thing that's very important for all of you to understand is when it comes to this particular population, when I go out across the country and I meet individuals, everybody asks, well, when you talk about the plight of chronic non-responders, how do these interventions impact this particular population in terms of what they're telling us to do in Common Core? And the reality is it's very, very important that you burn this next slide into your memory bank, and that is, according to the Common Core themselves, although they're setting grade-specific standards, they do not define the intervention methods or the materials necessary to support the students who are well below or well above. In other words, there is latitude given to schools to work with students who are testing at a level that is outside of the normal instructional range. And so that is what you're going to see is where the chronic non-responder comes in. So the second factor that most states are being held accountable to is reaching the bottom 25%. Where we used to have the subgroups, limited income, minorities, special education, at risk, they are now combining all of those subgroups into one big group, which is those kids testing in the bottom 25%. Now, that said, let's look at the status of reading achievement in the United States. As you well know, literally close to $1 trillion over the past decade and a half has been spent in impacting those students who are lowest literacy students. So I ask this question, given the amount of impact, the amount of interventions given, how'd we do? And here's the answer to that question. Are you ready? 8,440,000, 3,000, 40%, and 25 times. How did we do? 8 million. 8 million stands for the number of students in grades 4 through 12 who currently cannot read for meaning on grade level. 440,000 stands for the number of students sitting in American classrooms K-12 with a total reading vocabulary of 50 words or less. 3,000 is the number of students who will currently drop out of school today. In fact, every 26 seconds, a student will drop out of school. That's what we have. And finally, 40% is the average number of African American Latino students who will not graduate on time or with benefit of a high school diploma. And 25 times is the likelihood that students testing as chronic non-responders will fall into this category. All right, so that said, to say that we still have a long way to go would be an absolute understatement. So what we're saying now then is that in your district, in your school, you must look at interventions that specifically specialize in reaching not just the bottom 25%, but the bottom half of the bottom 25%. In other words, these are the students that the literature is now identifying as non-responders or treatment resistors. So who are they? Who are chronic non-responders? Well, chronic non-responders are students who have not shown even marginal progress in the current interventions that you're using. They continue to fall further and further behind, and they have not somewhat but pronounced reading failure. These are the students also that have multidimensional, and we're going to talk about their learning requirements shortly, but they have multidimensional learning requirements that prevent them from initially succeeding in phonics, sight, and or whole language. So regardless of the traditional reading intervention, they still are not responding. These are the kids who are angry and frustrated. They don't get along well with their teachers or peers. Many have concluded schools don't like me and I don't like school. They give up. They hate school. They get into trouble. And they are in need of what we call a serious reading attitude adjustment. Forget you. They don't believe in themselves. They're their own worst critic. In my book, The Failure-Free Methodology, New Hope for Non-Readers, I talk about when I was on a graduate school, when I was on the faculty of the Graduate School of Education in Southeast University, and we had a summer intervention program for students, and these were for students who had pronounced reading difficulties. They were coming in 1 hour a day, 4 hours a week, being taught by graduate-level students. And there was one boy that intrigued me. This boy came in, and he was 7 years old, and he always came in with the baseball cap, and he never took the cap off. So I started to say, why is this kid taking the cap off, not taking this baseball cap off? So I found out a little about the boy. 7 years old, had already been retained once in kindergarten, had already been retained once in first grade, and they were thinking about retaining him again. Why? Because he was a virtual non-reader, total reading vocabulary of 50 words or less. So I asked the question, why was he wearing that cap? And to my surprise and to my astonishment, I found out that he was wearing the cap not to hide his eyes, not to give him comfort or security, not to feel good about himself. He was hiding that cap, he was wearing that cap to hide one factor that he didn't want anybody else to know. That cap was serving a utilitarian purpose, and you know what it was? This young boy had a condition known as localized balding. Balding. His hair was literally falling out in clumps, and the reason for that was stress. This boy wanted to learn to read so badly that he took it out upon himself. So this notion that our kids don't care or they lack motivation is not true. Your chronic non-responders are probably those who have the greatest amount of motivation, because not only do they have to wake up and come to school, they have to wake up and come to school knowing that they're going to fail, and yet they come. So we have an obligation to meet these students. That said, let me share with you what I found. I found that most interventions, good interventions, are really reaching students that test between 1 to 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. Very few, if any, have independent data showing impact on students testing between a standard deviation and a half and 3 standard deviations below the mean. In other words, most interventions fall into this broad category. Very few are testing this segment, and this is the segment where the chronic non-responder lives. This is the kid that, let me give you a little statistical fact, for every 6 students you have testing as chronic non-responders, testing below the 10th percentile, you need 13 students testing at the 90th percentile just to compensate for what they're going to do to skew your scores. So these kids, while small in number, are very high in impact. Where are they found? Elementary, middle, high school, special ed, Title I, ELL, RTI. Take your pick. How are they identified? At-risk, minority, ELL. Look at this list, and you can add more to it. Now, my research has documented, and here's the good news, that we are underestimating the ability level of chronic non-responders. that chronic non-responders can succeed provided schools set the instructional conditions necessary for their success. There are two schools of thought out there in interventions today. One is the remedial school of thought. One is the compensatory school of thought. 95% of interventions are based on the remedial school of thought. That school of thought basically is that students carry within them a deficit that prevents them from succeeding. And what is my definition of reading? Gaining meaning from the printed page. Reading fluently, with expression and comprehension. We're saying out there that there is significant, in the remedial model, says out there the belief that there are deficits within the learner that prevent that student from reading for meaning with fluency and expression. 95% of the interventions fall on that model. Out in the wilderness, however, is those of us that believe in that 5% compensatory model. And the compensatory model is based on the premise that, yes, we know students carry with them deficits. But we also know that all, and I'm not saying this slightly, all students carry with them strengths. And if we set up the conditions within the environment, those students will have the opportunity to demonstrate the strengths that they bring to the task. So the compensatory model is based on the notion that we have to show you, the schools, the facilitators, what are the necessary instructional conditions that they must have for success. And finally, our research has clearly documented that it is possible to give non-responders an immediate, that's a key word, immediate opportunity to experience what it feels like to read fluently with expression and comprehension regardless of prior reading ability. So you can increase time on task. You can increase reading volume rate. You can increase their background knowledge, and more importantly, you can change their attitude and behavior, as this case study illustrates. Here's a young student, inner city school, arrived to America 6 months earlier, has already been tested from South America, has already been tested in a standard English test. He's testing in the first percentile in standard English. They're already considering referring him for special needs. What do you think the chances are that this young man sitting in third grade can read with fluency and comprehension from third grade material? Most of you, I would say, is little or none. Here we go. Length of time in treatment, 2 weeks. No longer referred for special ed. I'm trying to share with you that there is hope. There is an opportunity that we can share, provided you know the facts pertaining to non-responders. So what I want to do now is share with you what I call critical facts that everyone must know about how to accelerate the learning curve of your lowest performing students. And the first fact that I want to share with you has to deal with the teaching of reading. I know that if I were able to take the 12 leading reading research experts, put them in a single room with an armed guard, and tell them that they could not leave ever until they had a universal definition of what reading is and B, how it should be taught, they would starve to death until and never come out of that room. That said, there is one universal reading research fact that you can take to the bank. This fact has never been violated. It has stood the test of time, and that is this. All reading programs work, but they don't work for all students. You have to understand that there are different clusters of kids, and we have to make sure that the intervention matches the need of the student. Now, why is it that all programs fail to reach all poor readers? Because my research has indicated that there's no one universal group of poor readers. In fact, my research indicates that there are 3 distinct groups. And if we use this illustration of the low literacy umbrella, you have students testing, and by the way, I'm always talking about measurements of comprehension, standardized measurements of reading comprehension. students testing in the 49th to 35th percentile are your poor readers. Your struggling readers are 35th to 15th percentile, and then your non-responders are those students 15th to 0 percentile. They're 4 grade levels behind. These are the kids that we're talking about primarily. Let me share with you this. An intervention that works here does not necessarily work here, which is not necessarily going to work here. You don't want one intervention in which you're using variations on the same theme. As you're going to see shortly, you have to have viable instructional alternatives for those students who are not responding to the conventional intervention. This umbrella, as you see, closely parallels what we're already talking about in RTI. Tier 1, minor changes, we're not there. This talk has nothing to do with Tier 1 students. It barely has something to do with students that are halfway into Tier 2. But halfway Tier 2 and up to Tier 3, this is what we're talking about. Now again, let me reiterate what I've said. What works for one group does not necessarily work for the other. In 2004, we were contacted by Anne Arundel County, Annapolis, Maryland. They were doing probably the prototype for RTI in the nation. Said, Dr. Lockavitch, we've got a half a dozen RTI Tier 1 programs. We've got a half a dozen interventions for Tier 2. We have a half a dozen interventions for Tier 3, but we're still running into kids both in Tier 2 and Tier 3 who are not responding. We want to put you in one program, in one school. We're going to measure you with Dibbles, degrees of reading power, Woodcock-Johnson. We're going to use independent variables, and we'll see how we're doing. Well, that was in 2004. We're still there now. But let me share with you. When they looked at kids who fell under the 50th percentile, they saw that our intervention had an impact of 0.27. 0.27, it's small, it's greater than chance, but it's nothing to write home about. And it's not the paradigm that I just gave you. So I then asked, well, what would happen if we looked at, if these are the poor readers, let's see what happens when we look at the students, struggling readers, 20th percentile or lower. If that's the case, effect size should go up, and if it's strong, it's going to go 0.5, 0.6. Anything over 0.5, 0.6 is extremely strong. Well, look what happened. 20th percentile, struggling readers, 0.7, and we're hitting 3 out of 4 kids. That's good. Now let's look at the chronic non-responder. Let's look at the kids testing below the 10th percentile, and let's see what happens with the effect size. 0.84. This is verification of the model that I just showed. What works for poor readers does not necessarily work for struggling readers, which does not necessarily work for non-responders. You have to look at your interventions. Now, why do you have non-responders in the first place? Well, do they have characteristics that set them apart? My research has indicated yes. And I said that there are 3 characteristics, ED, PD, LD. ED stands for the phrase environmentally denied. These are kids that cannot read for meaning because they cannot relate to the material because they are coming from pronounced economic deprivation. Low income, parents with little formal education, their academic language is not frequently spoken. These kids need help because they're coming to school with limited background knowledge. That's the bad news. The good news is that you can expand background knowledge. Second, we've got kids that are PD. PD stands for the phrase phonetically deaf. For some students, phonics is not necessarily the first step in learning to read. Now, I'm not saying phonics is bad. I'm not saying that phonics is terrible. I've already said that all programs work. But if phonics is the conventional intervention that is being used in your school, then, and these kids are clearly not responding, then we have to ask the question why. And in many cases, my research indicates that phonics may be too premature or too complex or too confusing for low-income special ed students. So it's kind of like I'm going to teach you how to ride a bike. There are 2 ways to learn how to ride a bike. One way is I'm going to take you down Saturday morning, lay all the bike parts out on the floor, and I'm going to drill you on bike parts. I'm going to drill you on the wheels, the spokes, the handlebars, the gears. I don't care if it's weeks, months, years, you are not getting off that bike until you can, you are not getting on that bike until you can tell me about wheels, spokes, handlebars, gears. What's the second way? Well, the second way is I can put you on the bike and have you get a feel of what it feels like to ride the bike, and then I'll tell you about wheels, spokes, handlebars, gears. My research supports that notion of the second way, which is process-oriented. We have to get these students up on the bike. Many of these kids are stuck at skills, and because they're stuck at skills, we don't think they can ride the bike. That's not true. For chronic non-responders, process precedes skills. Now, I have to debunk 3 myths that are running wild out there in the literature and also out there in teaching and in interventions. First, that there's only 44 sounds in written language. Second, that phonics mastery is a prerequisite to initial reading success. And 3, that it's impossible to memorize all the words you need to know in order to have a successful reading experience. And I thought, as a little fun, I'd bring in some friends to talk about the notion of only 44 sounds in the written English language. I hope some of you know who this is. They are, to me, I grew up watching Ricky and Lucy, and let's see what happens here. Please note one thing, that Lucy would never make it in the world of politically correct. She's far too sarcastic, but let's see what happens when she and Ricky have a conversation of reading a story.
Now, you take this book and pretend that our child has come to you and said, Daddy, read me a good night story.
All right.
There you are, Daddy.
Once upon a time in the woods lived a peasant. He was a good man with a noble heart. He spent his time in the forest cutting down bushes from the trees.
Wait, just a minute. What is this bushes?
Bushes, right in there.
That's boughs.
B-O-U-G-H is bough?
Right.
Bough. He spent his time in the forest cutting down boughs from the trees. Cutting wood all day made his hands strong and raw. One day...
That's rough.
Spelled the same way as the other. O-U-G-H.
That's right. That shows how little you know about the English language.
I made a little mistake. Made his hands strong and rough. One day he cut wood so fast that by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, his day's work was through.
Hold it, Shakespeare.
Frau?
T-H-R-O-U-G-H is pronounced through.
True, that's what I always say. Now stop picking on me, will you? You're getting me all confused. His day's work was through. It started to rain on the way home, and he got so wet that his nose became red, and he developed a hacking... Who? I know it can't be cow. Oh, that's it. I had enough. Or should I say, enu? I know. I don't see why you have to have such a crazy language anyway. In Spanish, you don't have all those ow, o, u, of, oof sounds. In Spanish, you got a sound, it sounds the same all the time. You write it the same way, it sounds the same way. No matter where you put it, it comes out the same way.
And so you can see that just like Ricky, this notion that there's only 44 sounds is not accurate. One of the biggest problems we have is you have 5 letters for the vowels, and they have to represent 12 to 18 different sounds. And when you start putting in blends, it gets even worse. So bottom line, there's very little transfer to comprehension, which is what standardized tests are, when you get past first grade, as found by the reading panel, the failure in Reader First, and the Power for Kids study. And last, you can't memorize all words necessary to learn to read. Well, we believe the third characteristic, language, LD, stands for language deprived, language deprivation. Illiteracy, in our opinion, is but a symptom. Language deprivation is the disease. There are 4 steps, in our opinion, to the reading process. The real base of literacy is not reading and writing, it's listening and vocabulary. And no student can read for meaning above their language level of comprehension. If you want a one-word key to raising comprehension in your school, that key is vocabulary. Chronic non-responders have dramatically smaller vocabularies. By the end of second grade, there's a 4,000 difference between the good readers and the bad readers. Third grade, students testing in the top quartile have a vocabulary equal to 12th graders testing in the bottom quartile. The average student learns 3,000 words a year. Our kids learn 1,000. The average student learns 10 words a day. Our kids are lucky if they get 1 or 2. So the bad news is they carry with them the 3 significant deficits. They're PDED, LD, phonetically deaf, environmentally denied, language deprived. The good news is that they can accelerate the vocabulary growth of chronic non-responders. Once kids start school, the research has shown is that they can acquire vocabulary at the same rate as other kids. That said, we have to accelerate their rate. We have to get them into catch-up. So researchers have identified 3 bodies of academic English words needed to be taught. They call them most common, Goldilocks, and rare. Most common is the base of functional literacy. English language is highly redundant. There are 2,000 words most frequently used in the English language. When students master those 2,000 most common words, they'll be able to recognize 90% of all the words they'll see in grades 1 through 9. Most of instruction out in vocabulary today is being done with Goldilocks or tier 2 words. They're the words that aren't too hard, aren't too difficult, they're just right. And then you have the rare words, which are unique to academic content. So here's the academic vocabulary literacy period. Most common, tier 2 rare words. The problem is most researchers have made the assumption that kids come to school with mastery of most common words. That is not correct for our kids. We have to start. Instruction must occur first at most common. Last, quickly, final research note. Text does matter in the teaching of reading. Beginning reading material for chronic non-responders is too complex. Phonics and site-based flashcard word stories have no meaning whatsoever. Whole language stories are totally unpredictable if you don't have the background and experience to relate to it. So what we found is that instruction for our kids has to control for repetition, sentence structure, and story content. Repetition is critical for ours. Chuck Hargish, University of Tennessee Emeritus, found that our kids, chronic non-responders, need to see words 75 to 100 times, but not drill and kill. McCormick at Ohio State found MEMC, multiple exposures and multiple contexts. Sentence structure is the most overlooked area in all of the teaching of reading. Most stories do not control for sentence structure. There is a developmental sequence. Kids can't read for meaning, not because they don't understand it, they don't understand the way in which it's being presented. Simple, active, positive, declarative sentences are the basic unit of understanding. And finally, story content. Multiple meaning words, idiomatic expressions, figurative speech, uncommon names, dates, and places, abundant use of pronouns, all confuse our kids. So here's your instructional checklist of text elements that are critical for reading success. How quickly are the words introduced? How repetitious is it? What is the sentence structure? What is in the story content? So in closing, I'm going to use Will Rogers. Will Rogers is famous for the 1930s, in which he said he never met a man he didn't like. I like Will Rogers because he also said, it ain't bragging if you've done it. What I'm going to do is use the last 2 minutes just to show you briefly what happens when you apply all of the concepts that we talked about and to chronic non-responders. And that's where Failure Free comes in. We specialize in elementary, middle, high school. This is our population because we've served over 1 million hours of intensive instruction. We're the front end to conventional instruction. programs were designed to work in conjunction with. We're the first program to control for the variables we talked about, such as this. And frankly, we use a blended learning model of teaching, where the teacher is a language teacher first, the reading teacher second. Everything she teaches on the computer is identical to what she talking software, which goes to paper and pencil reinforcement activities.
I'm Dana Frederick, and I'm at River Terrace Middle School. We started our program with the student participation about 3 weeks ago. The success of the children who have had very low reading abilities have been outstanding. They really enjoy the program, and I like it a lot too.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Shepard, and I'm a teacher at Marie Reed. I worked with the Failure-Free Reading Program for 2 years. I also worked with the CAT team, which is Teacher Assistance Team. What we did was we referred children who we were afraid may be special ed students or had other problems, tendons, behavior. And I pulled in all those children that were academic issues into the Failure-Free program. I pulled in 14 children, and out of those 14, we had one referred to special ed. And Failure-Free kind of helps me almost as a diagnostic tool in terms of if this child's progressing with Failure-Free, then he's probably not a special ed student. I also found that the vocabulary portion of the Failure-Free was wonderful, especially since our school is about 70% Hispanic and second language learners. I really feel that for our school, with the high ESL population, the vocabulary was the main impact for our students, teaching them the English vocabulary that they did not know.
So we have 9 published articles. We're listed in What Works. We're a model program, National Center. National Center for Response to Intervention said we met the gold standard. We had the highest score, and I want to end on a high note.
And I've seen a big improvement in her reading. I don't want to go to reading. I say you're going to read. Now she loves it. She can't wait to get here. Read all night and all day. There's a big improvement in her, and I'm so proud of her. I just shed tears when I hear her read. I put it on the tape recorder back and forth. I have to listen because I can't believe that's my child.
So in summary, it's never too late to impact those students who are causing you to lose the greatest amount of sleep. I said that I would end at 30 minutes. I'm right at the 30-minute mark. And Jamal, if you want to have, we'll unmute and answer for any questions. For those of you who are leaving, if you'd like to get a copy of this, we can send that to you.
We definitely want to thank Dr. Lockavitch for his very informative presentation. I hope you all enjoyed it. What we will do now is we're going to pull down the slides and we're going to open the floor up for questions. We want to give everybody about a minute to decide if they're going to stay on the line. Those of you that are leaving, you are welcome to send emails of questions to the following email address. That is JAMAHL.EVANS, Jamal Evans, @failurefree.com. If you email us your questions, we will respond to you promptly. You are welcome to call into the home office if you'd like to converse with one of the consultants over the phone. The number is 1-800-542-2170.